The scent of iron and cold marble was the only constant in John Miller's life, a familiar sanctuary that usually brought him peace. For 3 generations, Miller's meats had served the isolated town of Blackwood, providing hearty cuts to families who had lived under the shadow of the surrounding dense pine forest for centuries. John was a man of quiet observation, standing behind his heavy oak counter with a posture shaped by years of honest labor and a sharp eye for detail. Lately, however, the atmosphere inside the shop had grown as cold as the meat lockers, thick with a communal dread that no amount of winter wood could burn away. The town of Blackwood was shrinking, not from economic decay, but from a quiet, predatory theft that snatched people from the fringes of the wood. First, it was the drifters and the hitchhikers, those whose absence could be rationalized by the local police as simple wanderlust. But then, 3 weeks ago, young Tommy Higgins never made it home for his evening paper route, his bicycle found abandoned near the tree line, its rear wheel spinning aimlessly in the twilight. The town had rallied, scouring the brush with flashlights and shotguns, but they found absolutely nothing. No blood, no clothing, not even a single footprint in the damp earth. It was as if the boy had simply evaporated into the humid night air, leaving behind a vacuum of pure, paralyzing terror. John had watched the boy's mother break down right in front of his display case, her tears smudging the clean glass, and the heavy, simmering anger had taken root deep within his chest. He loved his stubborn, insular community, and watching it freeze in fear broke something vital inside him. The bell above the shop door chimed, its cheerful ring contrasting sharply with the somber fog rolling down the main street outside. John wiped his blood-stained hands on his white apron and looked up, expecting a nervous regular looking for comfort food. Instead, a tall man stepped into the warmth of the shop, shaking the evening mist from the collar of an impeccable tailored charcoal overcoat. This was Julian Vance, a wealthy land surveyor who had moved to Blackwood 6 months ago, claiming to seek the solitude of the rural wilderness for his architectural blueprints. Julian was a striking figure, possessing a sharp, symmetrical face, pale grey eyes that seemed to absorb light, and a demeanor that was always unnervingly calm. He walked with a calculated, silent grace, each step deliberate and perfectly measured, never making a sound on the old hardwood floors. "Good evening, John," Julian said, his voice a smooth, resonant baritone that carried a subtle, unidentifiable accent. "I see you're staying open late tonight, despite the curfew the sheriff has been strongly advising." John offered a tight, polite nod, his hands resting flat on the wooden chopping block, feeling the subtle vibrations of the town's anxiety. "People still need to eat, Mr. Vance, and keeping the lights on gives the folks on this street a little bit of comfort," John replied, his voice gruff but steady. Julian smiled, a slow, calculated movement that showed just a hint of perfectly white, slightly pointed teeth. "A noble sentiment, truly, though comfort can be a very dangerous illusion in a place like this," Julian murmured, walking over to the glass display case and examining the cuts of beef with the analytical eye of a critic. "The wilderness out there does not care about human comfort. It only understands hunger, patience, and the inevitable chain of consumption." John watched the man closely, noting how Julian's eyes seemed to linger on a fresh, rare prime rib, his pupils dilating slightly in the dim fluorescent lighting of the shop. There was something profoundly unnatural about Julian's stillness. When he didn't speak, he barely seemed to breathe, standing like a statue carved from winter frost. "I'll take 2 pounds of the venison if you have it, John. I find myself craving something a bit more wild tonight," Julian said, his grey eyes locking onto John's with an intensity that made the butcher's skin prickle. As John turned to the rear cold room to fetch the meat, he couldn't shake the bizarre, instinctual feeling that he wasn't looking at a customer, but rather an apex predator assessing another creature's territory. The air in the shop grew heavy with the faint, musk-like scent of decaying leaves and wet fur, a smell that John's highly trained nose knew didn't belong to any meat he kept in the stock. When he returned to the counter, Julian was gone, leaving the exact change in silver coins on the counter alongside a small, perfectly carved wooden figurine of a howling wolf. The silver coins Julian Vance left behind sat on the wooden counter, cold and mocking under the dim shop lights. John Miller didn't touch them immediately. Instead, he picked up the small wooden figurine of the wolf, turning it over in his calloused hands. The craftsmanship was astonishingly precise, capturing the raw, feral energy of a beast mid-howl, yet the wood itself felt strangely warm, almost as if it possessed a faint, lingering pulse. A heavy silence descended upon Blackwood as midnight approached, the kind of oppressive quiet that precedes a violent storm. John locked the heavy front door, flipped the sign to closed, and retired to his small apartment directly above the butcher shop, but sleep refused to find him. Every creak of the old building's timber sounded like a footstep, and every rustle of the wind outside resembled a low, mocking growl echoing from the tree line. By the time the weak grey dawn filtered through the grime-streaked windows, the town's fragile peace had shattered entirely. Sheriff Thomas was waiting by the front door of Miller's Meats when John descended the stairs at 6 in the morning, the lawman's face pale and drawn from a long, sleepless night. "It happened again, John," the sheriff said without greeting, his voice trembling as he stepped into the shop. Old man Marta's livestock was completely slaughtered in the middle of the night, not eaten, just torn apart like a crazed animal was playing with them. John's chest tightened as he grabbed his heavy leather apron. "Any sign of Marta?" John asked, dreading the answer. No, his back door was torn clean off its hinges, and there was a trail of blood leading straight into the northern ridge. The sheriff sighed, rubbing his bloodshot eyes. "The worst part is the tracks. We found huge canine-like prints in the mud, but they walk on 2 legs, spaced out exactly like a man's stride." The realization hit John with the force of a physical blow, his mind instantly flashing back to Julian Vance's calm, analytical demeanor the night before. He remembered the unnatural stillness of the man, the predatory dilation of his pupils, and the faint scent of wild wet fur that had lingered in the air long after he left. "Sheriff, did Julian Vance help with the search party last week?" John asked, keeping his voice carefully neutral as he began sharpening a long, curved boning knife. "Vance? Yeah, he was out there on the western ridge, mapping out trails for us," the sheriff replied, looking confused by the sudden question. "Why do you ask? The guy's been a godsend, using his surveying equipment to help us cover more ground than we ever could alone." John didn't answer, his grip tightening on the knife handle until his knuckles turned a stark, bloodless white. The creature wasn't just hiding in the woods. It was actively guiding the search parties away from its lair, playing a brilliant, patient game with the terrified townsfolk. Later that afternoon, the bell above the door chimed again, and John's heart skipped a beat as Julian walked in, looking refreshed and entirely unbothered by the town's growing panic. He wore a pristine beige wool coat today, and his silver-grey eyes held a glint of cruel, hidden amusement as he approached the counter. "Terrible news about old Martha, isn't it, John?" Julian said, leaning against the glass display case with an easy, fluid grace. "The town is completely unraveling. People are locking their doors, hiding in the dark, acting like cattle waiting for the inevitable slaughter." John forced his breathing to remain steady, continuing to slice through a slab of beef, the blade making a rhythmic scraping sound against the wood. "This town isn't cattle, Mr. Vance," John said softly, looking up to meet the man's gaze directly. "They're good people, and whoever, or whatever, is doing this is going to make a mistake eventually, because monsters always get sloppy when they get hungry." Julian's smile vanished for a fraction of a second, replaced by a cold, calculating glare that made the temperature in the room feel like it dropped 10 degrees. He leaned in closer, and John could smell it clearly now, the metallic tang of fresh blood beneath a heavy layer of expensive cologne. "Patience is a virtue the wilderness teaches very well, John," Julian whispered, his voice dropping to a harsh, vibrating register that sounded almost like a purr. "A true alpha doesn't get sloppy. He waits, he observes, and he eliminates the threats to his territory one by one." Before John could respond, Julian turned on his heel and glided out of the shop, leaving a single drop of dark, thick blood on the immaculate white linoleum floor. John stared at the crimson droplet, a cold certainty setting deep into his bones. The beast had just declared war on him, and if he didn't find a way to stop it, he could be the next one to vanish into the northern ridge. The drop of blood on the white linoleum floor took nearly an hour to dry, turning into a dark, rusty crust that John refused to wash away. It served as a grim monument to the reality he now faced. Julian Vance was not a man, but a highly intelligent, patient monster that was systematically playing with the town of Blackwood. John spent the remainder of the afternoon in a state of hyper-focused preparation, his mind racing through everything he knew about the creature from folklore, local myths, and his own sharp observations. Traditional tales spoke of silver as the ultimate weapon against a werewolf, but John was a practical man who trusted tangible evidence over campfire stories. He remembered the heavy silver coins Julian had left on the counter the previous night. The creature had hand-held them without burning, meaning the myths were either exaggerated or completely wrong. If silver wouldn't kill it, John needed to find something else, something rooted in the anatomy of a predator that could level the playing field. After closing the shop early, John descended into the deep, concrete basement beneath Miller's Meats, a space that had served as his family's private smokehouse and tool storage for half a century. The air down here was thick with the scent of hickory smoke, dried salt, and aged iron, a combination that masked the faint odor of fear that had begun to sweat from his pores. He walked past the rows of hanging iron hooks and approached an old, reinforced steel gun safe that had belonged to his grandfather, a man who had fought in the deep forests of Europe during the war. With trembling fingers, John spun the mechanical dial, the heavy clicks echoing like gunshots in the damp, enclosed space of the basement. The heavy door swung open with a rusty groan, revealing a modest collection of hunting rifles, boxes of ammunition, and the tarnished copper lockbox hidden beneath a canvas tarp. John pulled the lockbox out and placed it on his work table, prying open the corroded latch to reveal his grandfather's old journals from the late 1940s. The pages were yellowed and fragile, covered in tight, meticulous cursive that detailed encounters with unnatural beasts in the Black Forests of Germany. John flipped through the pages frantically until his eyes landed on a sketched diagram of a massive bipedal wolf, accompanied by underlined notes in the margins. According to his grandfather's first-hand accounts, the creature's hide was practically impervious to standard lead bullets, which merely flattened against its dense muscle and instantly self-healing skin. However, the journal noted a critical weakness. The creature's hyperacute nervous system made it violently allergic to aconitum, commonly known as wolf's bane, and a specific chemical compound found in the high-grade industrial lye. Lye, a highly caustic alkaline substance, was something John kept in massive quantities in the basement to clean the heavy fat rendering vats and sanitize the slaughtering equipment. A plan began to form in John's mind, dangerous and desperate, but it was the only chance he had to save his town from total annihilation. He mixed a highly concentrated solution of the caustic lye, boiling it down until it became a thick, gelatinous paste that could coat a weapon without dripping off. Next, he retrieved his heaviest, most reliable tool from the wall rack, a custom-forged 2-pound carbon steel meat cleaver with a reinforced hickory handle, a tool he had used for 20 years to split the densest bones of cattle. He meticulously coated the razor-sharp edge of the cleaver with the toxic-like paste, allowing it to dry into a venomous, invisible glaze that would burn through the flesh on contact. He didn't stop there. He also took several heavy iron meat hooks, sharpening their tips to needle-like points and soaking them in the caustic solution until they gleamed with a deadly chemical sheen. As he finished his grim preparations, the overhead lights in the basement suddenly flickered and died, plunging the room into absolute suffocating darkness. John froze, his hand remaining wrapped around the handle of the coated cleaver, his ears straining against the heavy silence of the underground room. Above him, through the thick wooden floorboards of the shop, he heard the distant, unmistakable sound of the front door's glass shattering into 1,000 pieces. It was followed by a slow, heavy footstep, not the frantic scuffle of a common thief, but the deliberate, rhythmic stride of a predator that knew its prey had nowhere left to run. Then came the voice, echoing down the basement stairs, a deep, vibrating purr that caused the dust notes in the air to dance. "John, I know you are down there, tasting your own terror." Julian's voice called out, no longer trying to hide the monstrous, dual-toned rumble underneath the human facade. "The game is over, Butcher. It's time to find out exactly what kind of meat you're made of." The silence that followed Julian's taunt was heavier than the concrete walls enclosing the basement. John did not answer. He simply tightened his grip on the lye-coated carbon steel cleaver, his thumb resting flat against the cold hickory handle to steady his trembling hand. He moved with absolute silence, guided by 20 years of muscle memory through the pitch-black layout of his own cellar. He slipped behind a massive hanging carcass of beef that hung from the central ceiling track, using the dense frozen meat as a shield to mask his body heat and breath. Above him, the cellar door creaked open on its ancient iron hinges, and the slow, rhythmic thudding began to descend the wooden stairs. Each step sounded heavier than the last, accompanied by a wet, clicking sound, the sound of long, obsidian claws tearing into the pine wood as the creature abandoned its human posture. The air in the basement rapidly transformed, growing thick with the suffocating hot stench of a slaughterhouse floor combined with copper and stagnant swamp water. "You think you're a hunter because you slice dead flesh, John," Julian's voice rumbled, not completely devoid of its aristocratic charm, replaced by a dual-toned, guttural roar that vibrated the very fillings in John's teeth. "You're just a clerk in an apron, hiding in the dark from the true master of these woods." A massive shadow stepped off the bottom stair, silhouetted against the dim moonlight trickling down from the broken shop windows above. The creature was monstrous, standing easily 7 feet tall, its torso a dense mass of corded muscle covered in coarse, midnight black fur that seemed to swallow the ambient darkness. Its head was an elongated, nightmarish hybrid of a man and wolf, featuring a jaw packed with jagged, overlapping teeth and eyes that burned with a sick, intelligent crimson glow. It paused, its snout twitching violently as it caught the scent of the hickory smoke and salt, trying to isolate John's specific scent from the surrounding meat. Julian took a long, calculated step toward the center of the room, his long arms ending in curved talons that scraped against the concrete floor, leaving deep white gouges behind. He was patient, moving with the terrifying confidence of an apex predator that knew its prey was trapped in a box. As the beast passed the second hanging carcass, John struck, not with a heroic roar, but with the silent, brutal efficiency of a professional tradesman. He reached out and violently shoved the frozen 100-pound slab of beef, sending it swinging along the iron track directly into the side of the werewolf's head. The heavy mass struck the creature with a dull, echoing crash, staggering the massive beast sideways and forcing a startled yelp from its throat. Before Julian could recover his balance, John stepped out from the shadows, bringing the heavy carbon steel cleaver down in a vicious overhead arc aimed directly at the creature's thick shoulder. The razor-sharp blade bit deep into the dense muscle, and the moment the caustic-like glaze made contact with the open wound, a violent chemical reaction occurred. The werewolf let out a high-pitched, agonizing shriek that shattered the remaining light bulbs in the ceiling as the concentrated lye literally began to liquefy its flesh on a cellular level. Thick, black blood hissed and bubbled where the blade had struck, the creature's legendary self-healing factor completely neutralized and corrupted by the alkaline poison. In a frenzy of blind agony, Julian swung his massive arm backward, his claws catching John across the chest, tearing through his leather apron and sending the butcher flying across the room into his work table. John hit the ground hard, the breath exploding from his lungs as the cleaver clattered across the concrete, landing just out of reach. He gasped for air, looking up to see the beast thrashing wildly, clutching its smoking shoulder as the caustic burn spread down its arm like wildfire. Realizing its survival was at stake, the creature's intelligent patience turned into pure, feral rage. It locked its crimson eyes onto John and lunged forward with its jaws wide open. John did not scramble for the cleaver. Instead, his hand gripped the heavy iron meat hook he had strategically placed on the edge of the work table earlier. As the monster collapsed over him, John thrust the needle-sharp lye-soaked hook upward with all his remaining strength, driving it deep into the soft, unprotected flesh beneath the creature's jaw. The chemical reaction was instantaneous and catastrophic. The lye burned through the werewolf's vocal cords, reducing its roar to a wet, suffocating gurgle as the poison entered its major arteries. The beast convulsed violently, its massive weight pinning John to the floor as its crimson eyes flickered, clouded over with grey, and finally went entirely dark. For a long time, John lay beneath the immense, cooling mass of the beast, listening to the slow dripping of black, foul-smelling blood onto the concrete floor. With an exhausting effort, he dragged himself out from under the carcass, his chest bleeding but his spirit unbroken as he surveyed the fallen terror. The next morning, the townsfolk of Blackwood gathered outside the butcher shop, staring in stunned, reverent silence at the massive fur-covered body John had dragged out onto the main street. The curse that had paralyzed their community was permanently broken, and though John would bear the physical scars of the encounter for the rest of his days, the town was finally safe. Behind his repaired counter later that week, John Miller stood quietly, a man who had successfully defended his herd, proving to the dark wilderness that the most dangerous predator of all was a man protecting the people he loved.